They are two different U.S. territories that share the same dramatic Caribbean skies. With a stunning harbor named after a Danish queen, famous arcs of white sand, and shimmering blue waters. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands are a tropical paradise. But they've also been called America's third border, with miles of tough coast to guard, waters where smugglers thrive, and one of the most heavily protected ports in the nation. They've played leading roles in one of the darkest periods in human history, when slave ships loomed on the horizon. Brutal colonial powers built massive fortifications to exploit the riches of the New World. And enslaved African men and women fled to the top of a towering bluff to make their daring bid for freedom. Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands may be 1,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, but that's never stopped the people of these Caribbean territories from making their mark on history. It was here where a king of Latin pop took the stage alone for the very first time, where refugees from communist Cuba are known for one of the biggest names in rum, and where a hurricane turned a talented swimmer into a future NBA star. There's no end to the surprises of these two Caribbean lands, where dramatic cliffs are carved by the ravages of the sea, mountains touch the sky, and a landscape of giant sinkholes happens to be the perfect place to study the universe. These are the fascinating tropical lands of the U.S. Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. When humans first reached what are now the U.S. territories in the Caribbean, as many as 5,000 years ago, this is what they would have seen. Dramatic cliffs rising out of the sea, stunning islands of all shapes and sizes, dazzling beaches, and towering mountains, all under dramatic Caribbean skies. It was as wild and beautiful a land as any on Earth, untouched by human hands. Little is known about the first people to discover the islands of the Caribbean, but we know much more about those who followed and were here when Europeans first arrived in the 15th century. They were members of the Arawak culture who lived along the Orinoco River in what's now Venezuela. It was roughly about 400 BC that they started voyaging up and across the islands that are known as the Lesser Antilles, which arc across the Caribbean Sea. They include the U.S. Virgin Islands. Eventually, these groups also fanned out further across the islands of the Greater Antilles and what are now Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, and Cuba. Over millennia, the various peoples who settled the islands of the Caribbean developed a complex, shared culture. They called themselves the Taino, which means the good people in their language. They made ceremonial stone and clay figures, called semis, of the many gods and spirits they worshipped. This is a giant version of what one of these ritual objects looks like. It's a museum of Taino culture here in the Puerto Rican town of Jayuya. The Taino's spiritual life was deeply connected to the natural world around them. And in Puerto Rico, there was no place as powerful as a lush mountainous forest that's known today as El Yunque. It's the only rainforest in the U.S. National Forest System. El Yunque lies on the eastern side of Puerto Rico and gets hit hard by rain-laden trade winds from the Atlantic Ocean. It rains 3 times a day here, on average. Its highest reaches are often completely covered in clouds. After all that moisture makes its way down through the canopy to the forest floor, it creates the dazzling rivers and waterfalls for which El Yunque is famous. The Taino believed that a benevolent god called Yokahu dwelled on El Yunque's peak. They often prayed for his protection from the more ominous spirit that controlled the winds. His name, Huracan, is the origin of the English word hurricane. But little did the Taino know that the greatest threat to their existence wouldn't come from one of their gods, but from European colonial powers. On November 14, 1493, the native people living on the island of St. Croix awoke to find 17 strange masted vessels looming on the horizon. It was a massive flotilla of Spanish ships commanded by Christopher Columbus. It was here, near the entrance to Salt River Bay, that Columbus's party first set foot on what would later become U.S. soil. That small stretch of sand is now known as Columbus Landing Beach. 24 Spanish sailors paddled up the Salt River to explore the island of St. Croix, but ended up in a deadly skirmish that killed one Spaniard and one Caribbean native. It was the first documented armed conflict between Europeans and native people in the Caribbean, and foreshadowed the fate that these tribes would suffer at the hands of European powers. After sailing through the Virgin Islands, Columbus landed on nearby Puerto Rico. He gave it the name San Juan Bautista, which is how the Puerto Rican capital, San Juan, got its name. But 15 years went by before Spain established a permanent settlement here. In 1508, explorer Juan Ponce de Leon chose an inland spot for that settlement that is known as Capara. In 1936, archaeologists uncovered the foundation of the house where he lived. The Taino had welcomed the Spanish, but they were soon treated as slaves. The better armed Spaniards forced them to labor in the hills of their own island in search of gold. Any Taino who rebelled were brutally tortured or executed. Many others died from European diseases. The gold the Taino mined was why the island came to be known as Puerto Rico, which means rich port in Spanish. Today, tourism, not gold, is an important part of Puerto Rico's economy. After giant cruise ships like these pull up to the docks of San Juan, their passengers eagerly flood the streets of the oldest city on U.S. land. The Spanish moved the capital here to San Juan in 1521. One of their first major buildings was the San Jose Church. It was built by Dominican friars. Today, it's the second oldest church in the Americas. Spain's fortunes of silver and gold from the Caribbean and Central and South America quickly grew, but so too did the struggle between European nations to control Puerto Rico, since its harbor was perfectly positioned on trade routes to and from the New World. One of old San Juan's nicknames is the Walled City, thanks to the massive defenses that surround it. In the 1600s, the only way to get in or out of the city was to pass through one of a series of towering gates. Only one is still standing. It's known as Puerto San Juan. Gates like this one helped the Spanish track and control trade. But every night, Puerto San Juan's heavy doors were locked to protect the city and its residents from invaders. The Spanish believed there were enemies on all sides. Native people might attack them by land, while European powers might try to invade them by sea. In order to defend Old San Juan, which lies on an island, the Spanish ended up building 4 different forts. The very first Spanish fort here was completed in 1540 and is known as La Fortaleza. But its location inside the harbor made it vulnerable. A Spanish historian at the time wrote that only blind men could have chosen the site for this fort. So, in 1539, the Spanish began building even larger defenses that would become the jewel in Puerto Rico's crown, a fort known simply as El Morro. Even before it was completed, El Morro suffered multiple attacks. On the night of November 23, 1595, a British privateer named Sir Francis Drake and 1,500 of his men launched an assault on San Juan. Drake wanted to burn Spanish ships in the harbor so England could get its hands on their gold. But he and his men were forced to retreat, empty-handed, except for a few Spanish prisoners. More attacks on San Juan followed by the English, Dutch, and French, and so the Spanish kept increasing El Morro's defenses, turning it into the massive triangular fortification it is today. It was given thick walls to stop cannonballs and ramps so that troops, guns, and cannons could be put in place quickly to fend off attack and fire back. To keep an eye out for invaders, sentry boxes or garitas like this one were positioned strategically around the fort. They are such an iconic symbol of Puerto Rico today that they were chosen for an image on the Puerto Rican license plate. Thanks to its forts, Spain was able to maintain control of Puerto Rico, but it wasn't long before other colonial powers were moving in on the nearby Virgin Islands. When Christopher Columbus first navigated the islands of the Caribbean, he was so awestruck by their beauty that he named them the Virgins, in reference to a famous Catholic legend. The Spanish were never really interested in the Virgin Islands, but other European powers were soon vying to establish settlements here. They wanted the islands to grow lucrative crops like sugarcane, which was practically the next best thing to gold at the time. But it was the Danish who finally succeeded in taking control of the island of St. Thomas in 1666. They soon set about building a fortified tower known as Skeisborg, or Sky Tower, in order to keep an eye on enemy ships offshore. St. Thomas was soon the heart of Denmark's Virgin Islands colony, which they called the Danish West Indies. Skeisborg now lies on the grounds of a hotel, but it still looks out over St. Thomas's large deep-water harbor and the thriving port town that the Danish named after their queen, Charlotte Amalia. In 1673, a Danish ship arrived in the harbor of Charlotte Amalia carrying 103 enslaved African men and women. They were the first of more than 100,000 enslaved people who were taken from their villages in West Africa and shipped to the Danish Virgin Islands. These human lives became a key piece of an elaborate international economic system known as the transatlantic slave trade. Between the late 1600s and the 1800s, roughly 450 Danish slave ships left the African coast for the Caribbean. When they finally arrived in the Virgin Islands, about 3 months later, roughly 13% of the enslaved Africans on board had already died or gone missing. Often, the captains and crew simply tossed the bodies of the dead and sick overboard. As the ships wound their way through the Virgin Islands, very few, if any, of the enslaved passengers would have seen the landforms they passed by. Their entire journeys were spent below deck, chained to narrow bunks. After arriving at the docks of Charlotte Amalia, the enslaved African men and women were sold at auction, and then sent on to plantations across the Danish West Indies. One of the biggest lay on the island of St. Croix. These stone ruins are what remain of the Wim sugar plantation, which was first established in the early 1700s. This is the Great House, where the owners lived. It's surrounded by a dry moat, which helped keep the house and those inside cool. But all around the house, enslaved Africans spent their days in the hot Caribbean sun, growing and harvesting sugarcane and running the mill that turned it into a variety of products for export. Many slaves on plantations across the region tried to escape. When they did, they were labeled maroons, after a Spanish word that means untamed. One place that escaped slaves fled to was the dramatic northwest coast of St. Croix, a place known today as Ham's Bluff. They hid out in the rugged terrain of this still very wild corner of the island. From the top of the bluff, where the old Ham's Light now stands, the African men and women are said to have tried to hail passing ships, hoping that they would carry them to freedom. Bounties were paid for escaped slaves caught dead or alive, and armed militias conducted regular hunts, trudging across the hills here at Ham's Bluff to flush out the maroons and deliver them back to the plantations they had fled. Danish law allowed for the brutal punishment of escaped slaves. They could be burned alive, hanged, whipped, or have their ears amputated. By November 1733, a group of slaves had had enough and decided to revolt. Their now famous rebellion happened on the eastern side of the island of St. John, in a Danish stockade known as Fortsburg. The crumbling remains of that fort can still be seen from the air. It was here that about 14 slaves arrived with knives hidden in bundles of wood. They killed several Danish soldiers in the garrison and then fired cannon shots from the ramparts to signal the others that the revolt was on. For the next 6 months, West African slaves controlled St. John and its more than 100 plantations. But eventually, 200 French soldiers from the island of Martinique came to the aid of the Danish. They landed on St. John and hunted down those responsible for the raid. Some of the slaves are said to have fled up to the top of this cliff, known as Ram's Head, on the southernmost corner of the island. Then, they flung themselves off the edge, down to the rocks and sea below, preferring suicide to capture. Others were promised forgiveness if they surrendered, but were then brutally executed once they were in custody. Following the revolt, the Danish imposed even tighter restrictions on slaves. Almost 60 years later, in 1792, Denmark announced that it would soon be illegal for Danish ships to participate in the slave trade. But it didn't ban slavery itself. It wasn't until 1848 that slaves in what are now the U.S. Virgin Islands won their freedom by laying siege to the Danish fort in Frederiksted, here on the west side of the island of St. Croix. Today, in the center of Frederiksted lies Emancipation Park. To honor that historic day and the unimaginable suffering that enslaved Africans across the Caribbean endured for 175 years. Without slave labor, the economy of the Danish West Indies crashed. The U.S. Congress was fearful that the islands might fall into Germany's hands during World War I. So the U.S. decided to buy them from the Danish government in 1917 for $25 million. Today, the vast majority of those who live in the U.S. Virgin Islands are of African descent, and age-old African traditions are still alive on the streets of one of St. Croix's main towns, Christiansted. On special festival days, hundreds gather in the streets. They eagerly await the arrival of famous figures known as Makojumbis. This tradition of stilt dancing is believed to have originated in West Africa and has been practiced here for more than 200 years. The reason Makojumbis are tall is so they can reach up to the evil spirits above and drive them away by mocking them. Some still believe today that Mako Jumbies have supernatural powers. And every year on St. Croix, new dancers are trained in this age-old art form. On big festival days, Mako Jumbies transform this former Danish colonial city into a party town that blends traditions from Africa, Europe, and the islands themselves. It was also here in Christiansted that NBA legend Tim Duncan first started shooting hoops before he left St. Croix and went pro. Duncan was born here on the island, but he didn't start out as a basketball player. As a teenager, he was a top freestyle swimmer with plans of competing in the 1992 Olympics. But in 1989, the only Olympic-sized swimming pool on the island for him to train in was ripped to pieces by Hurricane Hugo. With no place left to swim, Duncan took up basketball instead. In 1997, he was the #1 draft pick of the San Antonio Spurs and was awarded MVP in 2002. Many consider him to be the best power forward the NBA has ever known. The island of St. Croix is the largest of the 3 main U.S. Virgin Islands. It's also home to nearly half of all 104,000 residents of this U.S. territory. Most of the others live on the island of St. Thomas, which is one reason the hills above the historic harbor of Charlotte Amalia are packed with homes, hotels, and million-dollar mansions. But the last of the big 3 U.S. Virgin Islands, St. John, is largely uninhabited. When Lawrence Spelman Rockefeller, a son of John D. Rockefeller, visited the Virgin Islands in 1956, he was so awestruck by the beauty of St. John that he purchased 5,000 acres of the island. He then donated them to the U.S. government to create the new Virgin Islands National Park. It has since grown to nearly 13,000 acres and includes reefs and smaller islands along St. John's coast. With so much of the island protected, there are only about 4,000 permanent residents on St. John today. Most of it remains wild. Like St. Thomas, St. John was created by volcanic eruptions deep under the sea, with stunning reefs and uninhabited shores. Many come here to float across the ancient volcanic seabed of the Lesser Antilles and peer down on the colorful creatures that call it home. The U.S. Virgin Islands share the same blue waters with their U.S. neighbor, Puerto Rico. But there are very different stories about how these Caribbean territories came to be part of the United States. To get the Virgin Islands, the U.S. sent Denmark $25 million, which would probably be worth about $500 million today. But getting its hands on Puerto Rico took a military invasion with thousands of troops during America's war with Spain. In late July 1898, more than 3,000 U.S. troops arrived here at the mouth of a quiet bay on the southern coast of Puerto Rico. They were preparing to invade the island and seize it from Spain, just a few months after a deadly strike on U.S. forces in Cuba. At the time, Puerto Rico and the island of Cuba were still under Spanish control. In February 1898, a U.S. battleship called the Maine was mysteriously torpedoed in the harbor of Havana, killing 266 men on board. The U.S. declared war on Spain, and a few months later sent a naval fleet south to flush the Spanish out of Puerto Rico too. By 8:45 a.m. on July 25, 1898, the U.S. invasion of Puerto Rico had begun. The Spanish were expecting the Americans to attack from the north, which is why General Nelson Miles started his invasion here in the south. When the U.S. forces landed on the beach at Guanica, they came under fire. 4 Spaniards died, but there were no American casualties. General Miles quickly moved on to Ponce, which was the largest city in Puerto Rico at the time. Spanish scouts first spotted the U.S. forces from a lookout tower on this hill, where the giant Watchman Cross now stands. It was here in historic Ponce that General Miles established the first U.S. headquarters. But soon, the Spanish surrendered, and the short-lived Spanish-American War was over. When the U.S. and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris in December 1898, Puerto Rico was handed over to the U.S. government. It's been a U.S. territory ever since. Under the treaty, Spanish settlers retained their land rights. One of those former colonial families used their sugarcane fields and small distillery to create one of the biggest names in Caribbean rum, Don Q. Rum, which is made from molasses fermented with yeast, was one of the many products produced on plantations across the Caribbean. In the 1930s, the Sarayes family turned Don Q into a global brand. They used their rum fortune to build a private mansion that is now a museum and one of Ponce's most famous and visited landmarks. It's known as the Sarayes Castle. "80% of the rum that Americans drink is reported to come from Puerto Rico. Another mansion built by rum barons lies here in the hills just outside of San Juan. This is the Bacardi estate. It's easily identifiable by the signature Bacardi bat in the bottom of the swimming pool. The distillery of this world-famous brand lies across town. Bacardi wasn't originally a Puerto Rican rum. It was started by Spanish settlers in Cuba. But in 1960, the communist Cuban government seized control of Bacardi's assets. The family fled and set up shop in a smaller distillery they already owned here in San Juan. This Art Deco tower has been the company's headquarters ever since. Today, 70 million cases of Bacardi rum are produced here every year and are one reason Puerto Rico is one of the biggest rum producers in the world. When Spanish ships left the harbor of San Juan, loaded with rum and sugar, they also carried another Puerto Rican crop that was famous in Europe: coffee. It's still grown on plantations all across the Central Mountains here. The coffee bean, which originally came from Africa, was brought to the Caribbean on European ships in the 1700s. The lush mountains of Puerto Rico's interior proved to have the perfect soil conditions and climate to grow coffee. Soon, many in Europe considered Puerto Rican coffee the best in the world. With a population of about 3.5 million people, Puerto Rico has to import most of its food, but agriculture remains a key part of Puerto Rico's economy. Land that once held enormous sugar plantations on the south side of the main island is now home to fields of everything from corn to rice to bananas. There are also vast fields of plantains that are sprayed regularly with insecticides to protect them from unique tropical insects and diseases. They thrive on the water from the rivers and streams that tumble out of the island's mountains. But there's no more impressive crop here in Puerto Rico from the air than mangoes. This meticulously planted mango orchard is one of the largest. Mango farmers here have developed ways to grow this fruit year-round. Mangoes are Puerto Rico's #1 fruit crop. Roughly 80% of the mangoes from this orchard will be exported to Europe. 10% will end up in grocery stores all across the lower 48. Sugar, coffee, and fruit have all made major contributions to Puerto Rico's economy. But the most famous exports of this U.S. territory are its actors, entertainers, and sports legends. On the island's northern coast lies a neighborhood called Dorado. It's home to the mansions of many famous Puerto Ricans. They include golf legend Chichi Rodriguez and singer Ricky Martin. Martin didn't grow up here in Dorado. He was raised in San Juan. A talented singer as a child, he joined the Puerto Rican boy band Menudo when he was only 12. He sang his first solo for the band here, inside the Luis Ferre Center for the Performing Arts. The lights dimmed, and Martin took the stage alone for the very first time. After touring with the band, he went back and graduated from high school in San Juan, and then launched the solo career that made him a global star. San Juan and its famous beaches were also the stomping ground of a young troublemaker named Benicio del Toro. The future Hollywood actor attended this private Catholic academy, and on the weekends, he and his friends used to entertain tourists nearby at the Bridge of Two Brothers. They paid Del Toro $1 to see him leap from the bridge to the waters below. He later said this was how he first discovered that he liked performing. In 2001, Del Toro won an Oscar for a supporting role in the film Traffic. He now lives on the U.S. mainland, and that gives him rights not afforded to his fellow Puerto Ricans here on the islands. Unlike all the other former Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, Puerto Rico never gained its independence. It went directly from being a Spanish colony to a U.S. territory. Today, the U.S. and the Puerto Rican flag fly over its Capitol building here in San Juan, just as state and U.S. flags do on nearly every state house across the nation. But Puerto Rico is not a state, it's a territory. Like their fellow citizens in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Ricans hold U.S. passports, but are only allowed to vote in presidential primaries and local elections. They are not allowed to cast their ballots for the U.S. president. It's one reason that many in Puerto Rico favor the territory becoming a U.S. state, and why others believe that their beloved Puerto Rico should finally be allowed to gain its freedom as an independent nation. If it were a state, Puerto Rico would be bigger than Rhode Island, but smaller than Connecticut. Its land covers just over 3,500 square miles. And it's not just a single island. This U.S. territory covers 143 different islands, keys, and atolls. But only 3 of them are inhabited by permanent residents. The main island of Puerto Rico, Vieques to the southeast, and Culebra, which is famous for one of the most beautiful stretches of sand in the world. It's called Flamenco Beach and lies on Culebra's northern shore. Many travel to Puerto Rico just for a chance to camp out on this stunning arc of white sand. And it's hard to miss the strange object that lies right in the middle of Flamenco Beach. It's an abandoned U.S. Army tank covered with graffiti. It didn't end up here by chance, nor did this one higher up in the hills. These military remnants are evidence of a time when the U.S. government valued Puerto Rico not for its natural beauty and tourism dollars, but because of its strategic location on the edge of the Caribbean Sea between Europe and South America. It's one reason that Spain had made Puerto Rico its military outpost in the New World, more than 4 centuries ago. And Culebra wasn't the only Puerto Rican island used by U.S. forces. In 1941, at the height of World War II, military planners arrived on the nearby island of Vieques and started building this. It was envisioned as a long seawall that would connect Vieques with Puerto Rico's mainland 7 miles away. Its purpose was to create a protected harbor on one side for the U.S. and British navies, one bigger even than Pearl Harbor. But 2 years later, the Great Seawall Project was abandoned, leaving Vieques with only a 1-mile-long pier that still reaches out into Vieques Sound, over 5 miles short of its goal. It's known by locals as rompeolas, or breakwater. But the military's plans also included turning the island of Vieques itself into a massive new training area, bombing range, and weapons depot. And that work continued. To do it, the U.S. government forced many who lived here off their land. They gave them just 10 days to vacate and then raise their homes. The project fueled an economic boom in Vieques as hundreds of workers from across Puerto Rico flocked here to build giant weapons magazines like these for wages of $2.25 a day. For the next 50 years, the U.S. military and its NATO allies used Vieques for exercises and bombing practice. Craters from those bombs can still be seen today from the air. One of them ended with a terrible disaster. On April 19, 1999, a security guard named David Senes Rodriguez was at his post here on top of this hill in what was part of the military-controlled area of the island. He was standing outside, in the twilight, under a gray sky, when he heard the whoosh of two 500-pound bombs rocketing toward him from somewhere up in the clouds. The pilot of an FA-18 on a training mission had made a terrible error and launched his weapons at the wrong target. The bombs landed on both sides of Senes Rodriguez, just 50 feet away. Their powerful explosions killed him instantly. They also injured 4 others in the nearby tower on the hill. Today, a small cross marks the site where David Senes Rodriguez died. His death immediately galvanized the civilian population on Vieques, who protested the Navy's presence here by walking out onto the bombing range to prevent another disaster. Their years of work finally paid off in 2003. But up to 9,000 acres of this tropical island are still littered with munitions, as well as napalm, mercury, and other toxic materials. Piles of bombshells are still visible from the air. Cleanup will take years. By 2003, almost 18,000 acres of this former military land had been turned into the Vieques National Wildlife Refuge. Not far from the piles of bombshells, stingrays now glide unthreatened in the protected shallows along the Vieques coast. On the western edge of the island, former munitions bunkers are being reclaimed by the Puerto Rican jungle. And along the island's southern shore, herds of wild horses roam free, right next to the beachgoers who are happy to be reclaiming their piece of paradise. In 2003, Rumpiolas was renamed the Port of Liberty David Senes Rodriguez in honor of the watchman whose death led to the Navy's withdrawal. Bombers no longer drop their ordnance on the beaches of Vieques. But these days, teams from U.S. Customs and Border Protection use Black Hawk helicopters to scour remote stretches of Puerto Rico's coast, since drug smuggling and human trafficking are on the rise in the waters that surround this U.S. territory. "40 miles west of the main island of Puerto Rico lies one of its great treasures. It's a flat, kidney-shaped island known as La Mona. It became U.S. territory in 1898 when the Spanish had to give up the islands of Puerto Rico under the Treaty of Paris. The only historic building left here is Mona Island Lighthouse. It was designed by a Spanish engineer, but constructed in France, with a light so powerful it could be seen 22 miles away. Today, the lighthouse is no longer in use and stands alone on an island that's now a nature reserve. But since Mona Island lies just about halfway between Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, it's become a flashpoint for illegal immigration from Cuba, Haiti, and other nations in Central and South America. A team of U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents scours the coast, searching for the boats of human smugglers. Much of Mona Island is ringed by towering limestone cliffs and caves, which is why traffickers here have been known to force migrants to swim to shore. Many have drowned trying to reach this small stretch of beach. Patrolling Mona and its smaller sister island, Monito, is one of the many challenges for U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents stationed in Puerto Rico. But the biggest is trying to catch drug runners in the vast, endless sea that surrounds this U.S. territory. These days, rising quantities of South American cocaine are loaded on speedboats in Venezuela. Smugglers then fan out across the Caribbean. Some of these vessels can take just a few hours to reach the waters of Puerto Rico. Once the drugs hit shore, most are then repackaged and smuggled onward to the U.S. mainland and other countries around the world. Out here, spotting the tiny boat of a drug smuggler can be next to impossible, even with high-tech gear. Cargo ships are also carefully monitored for suspicious activity. And when those ships reach the harbor of San Juan, their cargo passes through one of the most heavily monitored ports in America. San Juan's port, just south of the city, is equipped with enough high-tech scanners to X-ray every single cargo container that arrives in Puerto Rico. But some of the drugs stay right here on the main island. In 2011, Puerto Rico law enforcement agents discovered that a major narcotics ring was located right next to the highest offices in the land. Close to Puerto Rico's Capitol building and tucked under San Juan's old city walls is the notorious community of La Perla. In the 19th century, La Perla was home to the city's slaughterhouses. Slaves also lived here, since they weren't allowed to live inside the city's walls. But it was recently discovered that a drug gang here was using La Perla as a distribution hub for at least $20 million worth of South American narcotics. San Juan faces many of the same urban issues that U.S. cities do today, all across the nation. But outside San Juan, there's a place in Puerto Rico with a landscape unlike any in the lower 48. Strange limestone hills that cradle one of the largest telescopes in the world. Along the southern shores of Puerto Rico, the waters are relatively calm. The Virgin Islands act as a barrier that keeps big ocean swells at bay. But that's not the case on Puerto Rico's northern Atlantic coast, which is famous for its wilder waves and weather. It's why the northwest corner of Puerto Rico is a surfer's paradise. This is the most famous surfing spot in Puerto Rico. It's known as Rincon. Waves here can reach 20 feet, which is what makes surfers flock here from around the world. A big part of what makes the north coast of Puerto Rico a surfer's paradise is what lies deep underwater, 75 miles offshore. It's a long chasm known as the Puerto Rico Trench. The floor of the trench is more than 8,400 meters below the surface, which makes it the deepest spot in the Atlantic Ocean. Because of the Puerto Rico Trench, swells from the Atlantic have little to stop them as they head toward land here and are perfect for surfing. When surfers here ride the waves, they have to be careful of the coral reefs that lie just offshore. Beneath the island's stunning blue waters are beds of elkhorn coral, which were named after their sharp, elk-like horns. Elkhorn is one of the first two types of coral in the world to be placed on the endangered species list. Swimmers and surfers here are forbidden to take pieces of coral from the reefs along Puerto Rico's coast. But scientists say that global warming is ultimately the greatest threat to this species. Coral may be just one of Puerto Rico's natural wonders, but it's also played a leading role in the creation of one of the most dramatic landscapes in the Caribbean. A forbidding region of towering hills, rocky cliffs, caves, and sinkholes. It's known as the Karst region and covers hundreds of square miles along the northwest edge of Puerto Rico, just south of the coastline. Karst is eroded limestone that was created millions of years ago when shifting tectonic plates started pushing up the ocean floor. Over time, the remains of coral, as well as the bones of fish and other sea creatures, fused together to create a vast bed of limestone rock. Then, over time, rain and weather eroded and sculpted that rock into the forms we see today. From the air, this region almost looks like a vast burial ground for giants. Geologists call these dramatic peaks mogotes. Very few Puerto Ricans live here among these otherworldly hills, for good reason. Deep below the earth, rivers actually wind through the limestone, constantly eroding the porous rock above. They've created an amazing cave system under these hills, known as the River Camoy Cave Park. But as the eroded rock moves and shifts, it can also trigger massive sinkholes without warning. This one, called the Tri-Town sinkhole, is 650 feet wide. Living in this region can be risky. This giant karst cave, part of the cave park, is a popular site for visitors to Puerto Rico, but it extends right under a road and even houses. In 1958, an engineering professor at Cornell named Bill Gordon came up with an audacious proposal. He knew that the Pentagon wanted to build a 1,000-foot wide telescope to study the upper atmosphere as part of its ballistic missile program. Gordon suggested building the massive telescope's curved reflector right inside one of the sinkholes. The Pentagon loved the idea, and soon Puerto Rico was home to the world's largest single-aperture radio telescope. It was named the Arecibo Observatory, after the town of Arecibo nearby. What makes the karst region a perfect location for this facility is that it lies close to the equator, which means scientists here have a clear view of all the planets in the solar system. The reflector is made up of 40,000 thin aluminum panels that can be adjusted individually to provide the receiver above with precision data. The receiver is suspended on cables strung from 3 giant support towers. Today, the Arecibo Observatory is operated by Cornell University and the National Science Foundation. Researchers from around the world come here to study pulsars and planets, and even to search for signs of extraterrestrial life. But moviegoers might recognize this giant dish from the James Bond film GoldenEye. In the movie, the observatory was a stand-in for a secret Russian satellite base in Cuba. At the end of the film, Pierce Brosnan ends up in hand-to-hand combat in the structure high above, with the film's villain, a former British agent, who Bond ends up dropping to his death onto the dish below. Today, workers ride an aerial tramway to get to the receiver. It's suspended more than 400 feet above the reflector and provides a spectacular view of one of Puerto Rico's most unique places. A modern scientific facility wedged into a primordial landscape. There's no end to the wonder of these Caribbean lands. With their historic towns, pulsing cities, and sunlit shores. They may lie more than 1,000 miles from the U.S. mainland, but Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands have always been an essential part of the story of America.